Dr. Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Debate is an important element of progress. Hi and welcome to our program, A View from Afar. We're webcasting to you from Auckland City in New Zealand, and from here tonight we will take a look at some of the big issues that are confronting global politics this week. But first, a little about what we are and who we are. Evening Report is an independent media outlet based here in New Zealand. It is a member of the New Zealand Media Council and publishes reportage and analysis about global and regional current affairs. This program, A View from Afar, is a joint venture with Dr. Paul Buchanan's security assessments business, 36parallel.com. We plan to webcast live each week around this time, where we will tackle the big issues that are developing around the world. Also, if you've joined us via social media, you can interact with the live show by leaving comments and questions. The best of these will be included in the program. So let's take a look at what we are going to cover tonight. So A View from Afar tonight with Paul Buchanan. The United States, a tipping point. What's happening over in the United States, particularly around Portland and other cities? Where is it tracking? Who and what is the problem? And what are the solutions? So let's get into our program and go straight to Paul Buchanan, who's waiting there to talk to us now. Good evening, Paul.
All right, so I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so you've been doing a lot of work and watching what is happening in the United States. So describe to us how you see the whole security situation as it's developing in Portland and in other cities and states around the United States.
Well, in order to do that, I think that what we'll have to do is take a little step back from the United States, put things in comparative perspective. And the way to do this is to think about authoritarianism and authoritarian tactics. And by that, what I mean is when authoritarians find themselves in bit strife, they resort to certain tried and true methodologies that we're now seeing in the United States, which is very unfortunate because the United States is an ostensibly liberal democracy. One of the tactics that are used by authoritarians is to incite violence in the city using irregular militia-type folk dressed in civilian clothes or dressed as anarchists who create mischief and mayhem. And that justifies the use of official repressive agent, be it the police, or in the case of Portland, Oregon, be it a paramilitary forces drawn from the federal government.
So you're mentioning there, Paul, you're mentioning authoritarian states, which is only a hair's breadth away from totalitarianism, isn't it? So are you talking about the Trump administration here in the context of authoritarianism verging on totalitarianism?
Yeah, what I'm basically pointing out, and others have done this as well, is that Trump is resorting to authoritarian methods to do two things. One is to intimidate and quell the protests that originated with the death of George Floyd and have morphed into the Black Lives Movement and protests about the entire tenor and tone of the Trump administration, but he's also trying to rally its base around a law and order ticket that there are rising crime rates in Democratic-controlled cities and states. And this is where the authoritarian transparency is apparent, because most of the protests in Portland, as in 90% of civil disobedience in Portland, has been peaceful. There have been episodes of violence, and I don't discount the fact that there may be some leftist-inspired violence.
Provocateurs from both sides?
Yes, there's a whole violent collective action logic where opportunists, thieves, and whatnot will jump in to a legitimate protest in order to take advantage of the situation. But here we got something more sinister.
Does that justify the Trump administration's response?
Absolutely not. And let me explain why this is an orchestrated, if you will, escalation that doesn't have a bearing in fact. Portland is well known for having white supremacists and right-wing extremists in its midst. It's also a very liberal city. I mean, it's got a schizophrenic character, if you will.
Well known for that liberal population. Yeah.
We tend to know more about the liberal side, but let's be very clear. Portland has a very active white supremacist movement within it, and it is suspected that there are elements within the police forces who share sympathies with some of these right-wing groups. And what appears to be happening, which has also happened in other cities, is that members of these white extremist groups have infiltrated the protest movement, and they are provoking. They are the ones who are committing the acts of violence, and then they run. So they throw rocks, they throw Molotovs at public buildings, they damage private property, and then they take off. And the peaceful protesters are left to take the brunt of the police response.
So we've seen that in some of the video that's playing as we are discussing this. You can see people getting caught up in that, exactly what you're describing. There's a case that has become quite prominent in the United States media where he's a military vet, former Navy officer, as I believe, and he is basically getting beaten with batons, pepper sprayed right in his face, and he turns around and gives them the finger. So this is the whole thing, isn't it? You know, that it's actually taking off into areas where there is peaceful people legitimately protesting, which is their democratic right. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. And this is where I have to go back to the authoritarian question. Because the dictatorships that I mentioned, again, both the left and the right, what they do is they'll put these agent provocateurs into an otherwise peaceful crowd, and then use the violence of these agent provocateurs to justify the use of state repression on the peaceful protesters. Again, it's a tactic used by authoritarians, and that way they can say that they're adhering to law and order, they're getting rid of these violent protesters, and that sort of thing, when in fact it's all orchestrated.
And orchestrated for what? What is US President Donald Trump's end game here?
Well, the short term is to delegitimate the legitimate peaceful protesters. So we have to remember that the provocateurs, the police, and now these federal paramilitaries that Trump has sent into Portland are working hand in glove. Two of the three in this equation have official sanction. The third, the right-wing extremists posing as Antifa or whatever they're doing, they melt back into the shadows, but they're serving the same purpose, which is to discredit, delegitimate the BLM movement and justify the use of force in other Democratic-controlled cities. And it's interesting because Trump is doing...
This is partisan then. You're saying democratically controlled cities. The governor, for example, in Oregon is a Democrat, yeah?
Yes.
And she has come out, I think there's a clip going to be playing now. Here she is on the screen at the moment. And she's speaking exactly to the point that you've raised here, where she is saying they just arrived, we have no warning, they're making it worse, they're inciting violence. We have this under control, we had it under control, and they must just get out. I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but that's the general message from her. Is that how you see it too?
Yes, let's understand that the federal government does have a constitutional right to send in federal forces to defend federal buildings, federal installations. I mean, the post office, for example, and certainly federal courts. They have the right to do that. They do not have a right to engage in crowd control outside of the immediate vicinity of the sites that they're ostensibly protecting. And these federal forces in Portland are roaming blocks away from the places they're supposedly defending. But there's also a more important point, which is when federal forces are deployed to supposedly supplement local law enforcement, they do so at the request of the local authorities, with the consent of the local authorities, and none of that is happening here.
Shall we hear what she says about that? I think it's around to this point where the governor is talking about it.
Or in public safety, they would be willing to de-escalate and engage in dialogue. Instead, they bring more troops to the streets. They take peaceful protesters off into unmarked cars. And unfortunately, last weekend, they almost killed a peaceful protester. This is absolutely outrageous. It is a violation of the principles on which this country was founded.
So what we're seeing there is clearly underscoring what you're talking about here. And she is saying it's just getting worse. It's not going to be getting better when you've got this outside control, and certainly by, as you say here, paramilitary troops. So where is the Constitution in this, Paul?
Well, again, the Constitution is being violated here, in fact, if not in principle. What the White House is ordering, and I should point out that this is the executive branch alone. The other two branches of government are not involved in sending these federal paramilitaries. And I just to tell you a little bit about the character of these federal forces, because it shows you the insidious and sinister nature of Trump's ploy. These federal forces are not military forces. They are brought from the Border Patrol. They are brought from ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the guys who pull people out of their homes and detain them prior to deportation. They're brought from the Drug Enforcement Agency. These agencies are all notorious for their anti-immigrant, racist views, and their unions are controlled by Trump supporters. So they have become very partisan agencies of the executive branch, and they are housed under the jurisdiction of the Department of Homeland Security, which is one of the most politicized of the federal agencies.
So we've been
drawn from outside of Oregon. There's no Oregonians amongst these federal paramilitaries.
That's by design.
They're brought into Portland as if they were an occupying force. They view the locals as aliens. They view the locals as hostile. And this, again, is a tried and true authoritarian tactic. I'll give you a parallel. The Chinese, when they send their military police forces to Hong Kong, and they've ringed Hong Kong with these forces, these people are brought from the interior of China, from provinces in China. They have no notion of what Hong Kong's about, and they are told that the Hong Kongese are spoiled, they're decadent, they're treasonous, and they deserve to be punished for their treason against the motherland. Well, here they may not go to such extremes to indoctrinate these federal forces, but the thrust is the same. You bring them in to what they consider an alien environment that is extremely hostile to their presence, and you expect trouble to occur, and in fact you go looking for trouble, as we've seen in videos where these federal forces have moved into the streets and arrested people, and then, unbelievably, thrown them into unmarked vans. And here's where the sinister level goes, it goes extremely high.
If it was,
I happen to have a background that included childhood and adolescence and young adulthood, being raised in Argentina and other Southern Cone countries during the dictatorships of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in Argentina in particular, one of the methods the military dictatorship used was to have men in gray suits cruise around in unmarked Ford Falcons, green Ford Falcons, to make the point. And they would take people off the streets, and those people would never be seen again. Now, in the United States or in Portland, it appears these people that are picked up in these unmarked vans are later dumped on the outskirts of Portland, and they are not harmed. But the effect is one of degree. It's an intimidation of innocent people for political purposes on the part of the U.S. executive branch against the will and the consent of the governor and the mayor of Portland, the governor of Oregon and Portland. And now Trump is threatening to repeat the whole exercise in Chicago.
I was just going to say that. He made claims earlier this week that New York, Chicago, that they're controlled by Democrats, that according to Trump, they're not doing a good job and he's going to send them in. Now we see them ratcheting up overnight, the attention on Chicago. One of the points I was going to bring in here is a comparative element of which you did. You brought in to the Latin American, South American kind of elements of comparison there. If this right now was occurring in Hong Kong to this degree, as in part and to a degree, by degrees, we've seen the situation over in Hong Kong escalating into chaos in the last few months. The world has been shocked and horrified. Is the world, this program's called A View from Afar. Should we be concerned? Should we be horrified? And should our governments be standing up, unified and saying enough is enough? You're a part of the international community. We do not support this type of federal governance.
Well, unfortunately, the geopolitical moment is not opportune for such a move, and I'll tell you why. For the first time in 3 decades, we have more authoritarian governed states in the international community than we have democracies. After years, decades of democratization, there's been a reversal over the last 10 years. Now, a lot of these dictators are elected into office and, very much like the Nazis in Europe, then withdraw the democratic liberties once they've been elected, claiming that they're legitimate and they represent the will of the people. And there's many authoritarians of this sort. Erdogan in Turkey is a classic example. Duterte in the Philippines is another. Viktor Orban in Hungary is yet another. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil is certainly headed down that path. So they get elected in, and then they close shop behind them. They close the door behind them. The United States is on that spectrum. The United States has a leader who clearly doesn't understand constitutional niceties, sees it as a document that, if not deserving to be trampled, deserves to be manipulated in his partisan interests, which gets me back to what's going on in the United States today. And what's going on is Trump is on his way to losing an election if it's held fairly. And so he's doing 2 things. You will have noticed that in the past few days, he all of a sudden has embraced all the pandemic advice that he rejected for 4 months up until this week. Wear masks, social distance, all that sort of stuff. You know why that is? Because the worst outbreaks now are in the very states where his base is located, in those very red states in the South and in the Midwest. They are now engulfed in that pandemic because they followed his skepticism. They followed his lead when it came to the early treatment of the pandemic. And the blue states on both coasts, which ignored his admonitions not to wear masks and to go about your life, they're doing a lot better. So Trump, on the one hand, now that his base is being literally infected by this disease, he's all of a sudden discovered science and discovered that we need to have, proper medical procedures for those folks. On the other hand, in the blue states, he's using these paramilitary forces under the justification that there's rising crime in these cities that is perpetrated by left-wing agitators, Antifa, and others associated with the Democratic Party, none of which is true, but will certainly rally his base. And I think that the bottom line is he wants to double down on the strategy in 2016, which is he doesn't need 50% of the vote to become president. He only needs 30%. The Democrats will then eat themselves alive arguing about identity politics. And so if he can cultivate that 30%, let's call it, to be polite, law and order base, I happen to think it's a lot more than that, but let's call them the law and order base, then it is possible that if the Democrats do in fact set to quarreling, let's say, for example, the left wing of the Democratic Party is not happy with Joe Biden for whatever reasons, that they decide to sit out the election as punishment to the moderate Democrats or the corporate Democrats, then he stands a chance of winning. And so what we see is, the carrot is him embracing science for the red states now that the pandemic has struck them, and the stick for the blue states because they've defied his orders all along, and quite frankly, they're exercising their constitutionally guaranteed rights to peaceful protest, except for the fact that they've now been infiltrated by these right-wing agitators.
Okay, so hold that thought. We'll just take a few seconds break and get back to discuss what are the solutions here? What is the way forward? Okay?
Sure.
So welcome back, everybody. So Paul, what is the solutions that are there as you see them, both constitutionally and on the ground, to Portland, potentially Chicago, and potentially New York City?
Well, the good news is that the first solutions are already being offered, and what they are is court challenges to Trump's executive orders. They're both in Oregon, in Illinois. New York has already levied a preemptive case, and then we have agencies like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which have all enjoined lawsuits against the unlawful use or unconstitutional use of federal forces for local law enforcement and crowd control. And disregarding the fact that these paramilitaries that we've been talking about are not trained in riot control, they're not trained in crowd control, and again, they have no jurisdiction outside the immediate vicinity of the public buildings and whatnot that they're ostensibly charged with protecting. So I think those lawsuits have merit, and I think that they will be successful. The question is, will the Trump administration pay any heed to any court order that prohibits them from deploying these sort of troops in the streets of cities like Chicago, Boston, and New York? And
so that sounds like a situation where, under your assessment, Trump has gone beyond the Rubicon, as they say. He's crossed the line. The tipping point has been established. And what solutions are there for Trump should he want to retreat back? We've seen him, for example, in geopolitics around the world, particularly with respect to Asia, where he'll push a hard line and then he'll retreat back. Do you see that he can do this now? Or is the public in a situation where it's thinking, no, we're over this, and there's no way back for Trump?
Well, he's lost a very significant institutional constituency, and that is the U.S. military. When he performed that stunt of clearing Lafayette Park with rubber bullets and tear gas so that he could stage that photo op holding a Bible in front of, I believe it's called St. John's Church on the other side of Lafayette Square from the White House. And when he used Secretary of Defense Esper and Joint Staff Chairman Mike Miley as props in that stunt, he lost the military leadership, because that was a supreme violation of civil-military relations in a democracy. The military is not supposed to be politicized, and they resented that. In fact, it was surprising that Miley held on to his job. And my understanding is that the chairman, the other generals on the Joint Chiefs of Staff were extremely unhappy with him and read him the Riot Act about how he got used. Well,
including Colin Powell, Republican, military general formerly. Absolutely called the troops to line, really, from what it looked like from way across the Pacific where we're located.
Former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, the immediate predecessor to Esper, denounced the move. But what's important for this discussion today is that the military is not going to have a bar of any of this sort of stuff. Now, it does go back to the question, if Trump ignores court orders to cease and desist with the deployment of these federal agents in what is clearly a partisan move, then what is the solution set? Well, one, which I hope we'll never have to go to, is that the governors of the state in question call out their respective National Guards against these federal forces. Now,
that could
no
bring
one in
like
their right mind wants that.
that could end up, well, let's just cut to the chase here. That could end up like a civil war type situation, wouldn't it?
It could. It'd be a microcosmic civil war. But think of it this way, and this is not beyond the pale anymore. If the National Guard is called out, let's say in a place such as Oregon, so the Oregon National Guard is called out, and the governor would say to the Trump administration, thanks, you've had your time here. We can take over now with our National Guard, who are Oregonians. And, good luck. We wish you well on your way back to Washington or wherever your headquarters are. If these forces refuse to leave, then it sets the stage for an armed confrontation between them and the Oregon National Guard, to which can be added these right-wing militias. I can't emphasize enough that the right-wing militias operate with the knowledge of the police and of these federal forces. They work hand in glove. It's a tried and true tactic, as I've said. And so we then have the setting the stage of what could be at least an interstate war. Now, I don't think it's going to get to that. I think that not only will the U.S. military, to which the National Guards have pledged, will come in on the side of the governors and say, we're behind the National Guard. We're not behind these irregular federal forces. But I also think that entities like Congress, even with all of the Republican obfuscation and enablement of Trump, will see that this is finally a line that should not be crossed. So I'm a little bit sanguine about the prospects that reason will prevail and the governors will get to regain control over the security situation in their cities. You never know what Trump's going to do when he gets desperate. His only interest at this point is to win the election, and perhaps if he doesn't win it, to somehow come on to power claiming that there's a national emergency and the vote can't be held.
Or call it off. Or call it off.
It'll be hard for him to call it off, but he certainly can rig it. Let's think of the voter suppression efforts. There are things on the table now that are outrageous, to include bankrupting the U.S. Postal Service, privatizing it or leaving it in bankruptcy so that it ceases operations. Well, absentee ballots are sent by snail mail. They're physical ballots. I in fact, have one here. I'm an absentee voter in Palm Beach County, Florida. And I have my ballot sitting on my desk for the primary in August. If he is able to do this, and he has some support in Congress to do it, then most absentee ballots will never reach the voters at all. That's one way to suppress it. He can also claim that with the pandemic ongoing, with the riots in the streets, as he claims, that the situation is one of a national emergency, and under his executive authority, he can declare a national emergency and suspend the elections for the foreseeable future. That's normally only done in wartime, in dire circumstances. But for Trump, given his vision of the world, the most dire of circumstances is the fact that he's going to get booted out of power. And so he's liable to do that. The question is, will the Republicans put up with this? Will they not understand that if Trump goes down this path, he'll be destroying the Republican Party along with his presidency? And it leaves a legacy for others to follow that, quite frankly, we really don't want if we want to see the United States remain as a liberal democracy, or now, I would call the United States today what the transitions and the comparative politics literature calls a hard democracy.
In closing, Paul, What would your suggestion be to those that want to express their legitimate right to protest? The mothers out there, you've got people who work in the hospitals, people who are concerned. You've got obviously those from the academic world. You've got others from the unions. You've got others representing ordinary people that are trying to get ahead. What's your advice to them considering the security situation that they find themselves in at the moment?
Well, what I would say is that they have to adopt yet another tactic from abroad, which is called the United Front. And the United Front approach is you put aside your particular differences because you're facing a clear and present danger, a common threat in the person of Donald J. Trump. And so you hit the streets in numbers that these federal paramilitaries cannot control, but you do so peacefully. You do so with militancy and regularity. You make it sustainable over the long term. And you continue well into October, again, peacefully, because then the overreaction that will come from the federal forces, and it will come, will seem disproportionate to the vast majority of Americans in an election year in particular, to whatever it is you're protesting about. And so long as we can get a mass of people, so everything from middle-class moms to university professors to high school students, and get them on the streets clamoring for change. I mean, at this point, you can start focusing your sights on Trump's removal from office via the ballot box. And so if you phrase your protest as a defense of voting rights, as defense of that democratic privilege that is to vote freely and fairly, then I think the solution will not only be the removal of Trump from office and a restoration of something akin to normalcy, but a reaffirmation that in their hearts of hearts, the majority of Americans are fair-minded people.
Thank you, Paul. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for the first episode of A View from Afar. Look forward to bringing this to you again around about this time next week, and it'll be a weekly show. So once again, stay safe, and I hope your week ends up being the best it possibly can.